Anyway, if I stand up, can you still see Eric? Is this in your way?
Oh, certainly no.
Okay. So everyone feel okay? All right. Again, as I was introducing, we're going to take a look tonight at what's called the Synoptic problem. Let's see, have my Greek come up here real quick. Session 8. To Synopticus, never mind, I went by too fast. The Synoptic problem and its significance for interpretation. It helps us to interpret the New Testament if we understand, especially Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's easier to understand it if we understand their interrelationship. And that's what we refer to as the Synoptic problem. Problem sounds like a strong term. It sounds like there's something went wrong in the New Testament. That's not what it means. It's a problem in that it's like a puzzle that scholars are trying to solve. We're looking at it and trying to say, all right, we know the order of the books in the New Testament is not the order in which they're written. We know that. So which gospel was written first? And why are they so similar? And in their similarities, why are they different? And that's what we're calling the Synoptic problem, trying to figure out that puzzle. And so we'll walk through it. Feel free to ask questions at any time, okay? Because I know I run off at the mouth a lot.
What part were they written first? How many years apart?
We'll introduce that, but to give a quick answer, we believe Mark was written about 70 A.D., which is 40 years after the events. And by the way, there's a good reason. There really is a logical reason why the Gospels are late writings. Paul's letters were all written before the first Gospel was written. Mark's Gospel, we think, is written in 70 A.D., so it's about 40 years after the crucifixion event. Matthew and Luke, we think, are writing independently. They don't know about each other, but we believe that they were written both probably around 85 A.D., and John's Gospel is late in that it was written, we think, between 90 and 100 A.D., in that time frame. So, and we'll show you the reasons as we go along why we believe these dates are there. But to give you the simplest answer as to why it's late, you would think, wait a minute, 40 years have passed since the Jesus event. You would think that they would have been writing this stuff down. There's a good reason they didn't. They didn't think anyone was going to be around to read it. We know from Paul's letters that virtually all first-century Christians believed that they were living in the last days. They believed that Jesus was going to come back at any moment, and when he did, when the playwright steps onto the stage, the play is over, right? That's what they're thinking. What happens is, as time goes on, all the eyewitnesses to the Jesus event are dying off, and Jesus hasn't returned yet. So that means there's now a second generation of Christians coming along. So they have to decide, well, Jesus isn't coming back quite so quickly as we thought. We need to write this stuff down. It's only after the apostles begin to die off that they decide we need to write a biography of Jesus for the next generation. That's why it's so late in being written. They had no need to write it earlier because, again, like I said, they honestly did not think there would be a second generation of Christians to read it. Does that make sense? Okay. Methods for studying the Gospels. Okay. All right. Now we studied Mark last time. Now that we've studied one of the earliest Christian Gospels, we can take a step back and reflect on what we've just done. Okay. The method of study that we did in Mark's Gospel, I didn't introduce it then. I'm going to tell you what it is now. We began by establishing the genre, a kind of Greco-Roman biography. That's what Mark is. That's what all the Gospels are. We then focused on this genre within the historical context. So what you're noticing is the way we approached Mark's Gospel is what we call the literary historical method, a method to study a literary text by asking how its genre functioned in its historical context and by exploring its historical meaning in light of its literary characteristics. That's what we did last week. Okay. And by the way, though we did it with Mark's Gospel, you can apply this tool to any of the Gospels You can apply this same text according to the genre to the letters, keeping in mind that just keeping focused on the genre. You can apply this tool to every single book in the New Testament. We just happened to use it in our study of Mark the last time. Okay. This method, as I say, is called the literary historical method. The literary historical method is not the only way to study the Gospels in the New Testament, as I'm going to show you. I'm going to introduce you book by book the different tools that scholars use as we go through our study. Another method which we will explore in this session is called redaction. So forgive the term, this is what scholars call it, redaction criticism. Do not think of the word criticism the way we commonly use it in modern language. Criticism today tends to mean to criticize somebody. Criticism in this in a literary context and in a study context, criticism means analysis, to analyze something, to critique it. Make sense? So don't get twisted up by the terms. It's just a term that scholars use. Redaction analysis or redaction criticism is the study how authors modified or edited their sources in view of their own vested interest and concerns. I'm going to show you, we're going to lead up to exactly a setup for using redaction analysis for studying Matthew's Gospel next, and I'll show that to you. A redactor is someone who edits a text. That's what the word means. The theory behind this method is simple. An author will modify a source of information to express certain concerns or interests. So by studying the changes, if you have the source material and you have the book you're studying, by looking at the changes that the redactor made, the writer made, then you can discern, ask the question, why did he change it? And by answering that question, you begin to see what the concerns are of the person who made those changes, why they made those changes. Okay, I'll give you a simple example right off the top, right off the bat. In Mark's Gospel, at the baptism of Jesus, Jesus goes into the river, and the heavens are split open, and a voice comes down from heaven at Jesus' baptism, and it says, and this is in Mark's Gospel, you are my son, with whom I'm well pleased. Okay, that's what God says. In Matthew's Gospel, Jesus is baptized, but the voice from heaven says, this is my beloved son, with whom I'm well pleased. That is an editorial change. If he's borrowing from Mark, why did he change those words? And the reason is, Mark wants to keep Jesus' identity a secret because people won't understand. That's one of the things we saw in the analysis. Okay, everybody will misunderstand the kind of Messiah Jesus is. So when God speaks in Mark's Gospel, he's simply addressing Jesus. You are my son. Nobody else hears it. In Matthew's Gospel, it's public knowledge. This is my son. God is addressing everyone there at the baptism scene. And that says something about Matthew's theology, which is different than Mark's, simply by that simple change in the word. Makes sense? Now, I mean, it's you might think, well, so which was it? What really happened there? Jesus was baptized, and God acknowledged him as his son. Who knew it? We can debate. That's but you know, that's one of the things we do in biblical studies. So that's what you do that's an example of redaction criticism, but I don't want to get too far ahead. So by looking at how an author of a gospel edited the stories about Jesus, we are able to determine the author's distinctive emphasis. Okay? If we start with the scholarly consensus that Matthew and Luke used Mark as a source, then we can apply redaction criticism to discern how Matthew and Luke modified Mark. So right now, all I'm doing at the moment is I'm introducing to you. I'm just saying, take as granted, but I can prove it as we go through this. Take for granted that Mark is the first gospel, and that Matthew and Luke are using Mark as a source. Okay. You might say, how do we know that's true? That's what we're going to do tonight. I'm going to show you why we believe Mark is first. Okay. Okay. But let us first demonstrate that Matthew and Luke did in fact use Mark as one of their sources. Okay. the synoptic problem. Okay. Everyone okay so far? Okay, introductions. Okay, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called synoptic gospels. Comes from the, I'll show you, synoptic gospel. It's a reference to the gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which narrate so many of the same stories that they can be placed side by side in parallel columns and so be seen together, which is exactly what scholars do when they're doing analysis of these gospels. They'll line up Matthew, they'll line up Mark, they'll line up Luke in columns. So the stories run parallel, and you can just look right across the page and see how they're similar and how the stories are different. That's why we call them synoptic. Okay, they have so many stories in common that they can be placed side by side in parallel columns and seen together. Indeed, they often tell the same stories using the same words. This phenomenon is inexplicable unless the stories are derived from a common source. I mean, now maybe we can chalk it up to a divine miracle, and that's fine. But just short of a divine miracle in the way the Gospels are written, and I do believe that, don't get me wrong, I do believe that it's the inspired Word of God. But human beings use sources when they write their Gospels. And so the fact that these stories are so remarkably similar implies some common source, some common interdependence. Make sense? Okay. Synoptic, by the way, comes from the Greek word syn and opsis. Opsis, I love that. That's one of my favorite Greek words. Ps, you can do the ps sound. Opsis. You can see view, opsis. I'm trying to think of another example.
Optical.
Well, optical is it? Yeah, but in that case, the ps sound is not in there. They use the pi, or in Greek p. Soon, opsis, together view, or to see together. Pardon?
In chemistry, there's a thing called an opsin. I forget what it is, but
Oh, okay. Well, it must be viewing something.
And synopsis.
Yeah, synopsis. Yeah, synopsis is.
You get to use that little sound again.
Yeah, together review. Yeah. Okay, continuing with our introduction here. But what is that common source? If we assume there's some common source for Matthew, Mark, and Luke, what is it? Okay. This question is complicated by the fact that the Synoptic Gospels not only agree with one another, but also disagree. So here we go. I'm going to use my little color bars and pictures to represent examples of stories within the Gospels that are similar. There are many cases. There we go. In this particular case, that means that the stories are similar. In this one, it means that the stories differ. Okay, do you see how I'm using the color codes there? Okay, just to help to illustrate. All right, there are some stories found in all three Gospels, others found in only two, yet others found in only one. Okay, and that's an example of that. The pictures are representing the respective stories. So in the three Gospels, there are some where they have all three stories the same in those Gospels. Here we have an example where it's not found in Mark, but Luke and Matthew share the same story. And here's one, it's a story that we find only in Matthew. An example of that would be the story of the Magi coming to visit Jesus, the wise men coming to visit Jesus. That's found only in Matthew's Gospel. Or the story of the prodigal son. That's found only in Luke's Gospel. Okay, and we're going to deal with those issues too. Okay, sometimes three Gospels share the same story with the same wording. That is amazing if they're not interdependent. They've got to be interdependent if all three of them are telling the same story in the same words. Okay, especially when they're quoting Jesus in Greek when he didn't speak Greek. He spoke Aramaic. How did they all manage to translate Jesus' words into Greek exactly the same way? There has to be an interdependence. Does that make sense? All right. Sometimes two Gospels will word the same story the same way, while a third will word it differently. Here, this is an example where Mark and Matthew are telling the same story in the same words, but Luke tells the same story, but writes it slightly differently, makes some changes in the wording. Okay. Did I miss something there? The problem of how to explain the wide-ranging agreement and the disagreements among these three things are called the synoptic problem. The problem of explaining the similarities and differences among the three synoptic gospels. That's the synoptic problem. Okay. Scholars have propounded a number of theories over the years to solve the synoptic problem. The one which most scholars have come to accept as the least problematic is called the four-source hypothesis. Okay. A solution to the synoptic problem which maintains that there are four sources behind the synoptic gospels, behind Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And that the four sources are Mark, Q, M, and L. I'm going to explain those. Okay. Mark you already know, because you've read it. Okay. All right. According to this hypothesis, Mark was the first gospel written. I'm not just laying that out there. I'm going to show you that in a moment, why we're saying that. Mark was used as a source by both Matthew and Luke, according to this theory. Okay. In addition, Matthew and Luke both had access to another source called Q, from the German word source, Quelle. And so we just call it, because it was a German scholar who first put this forward, we simply call it the Q source. And by the way, this has nothing to do with QAnon. It has nothing to do with scholars in the 19th century. Were already in the 19th century. We're already talking about Q long before it became a conspiracy theory here in the 21st century. Okay. Okay. Q provided Matthew and Luke with the materials which they found in common and which are not found in Mark. And they have a unique characteristic that we're going to talk about. Okay. Moreover, Matthew has a source or sources of his own found exclusively in Matthew's gospel, and scholars have simply labeled that source M for Matthew's source. Highly unimaginative, but that's what's they simply call it the M source. And really, I'll be honest with you, scholars are acknowledging, well, there's some stuff in Matthew's gospel that we don't find anywhere else. We assume Matthew didn't make it up. He had to have gotten it from somewhere. And so we just hypothesized that he had a source or sources, and we just lumped that together in just the letter M, saying anytime you see M in this hypothesis, it's always referring to material that's unique to Matthew.
Would that have been a verbal source or a written source?
We don't know, and I'll mention that in a moment. But that's a good question. We honestly do not know the answer to that question. It could be some of his material could have been oral tradition. Some of it could have been written sources. We do not know. In fact, that's the least we know about. We know Mark because we've got copies of Mark. We have a very strong material to presume Q. We know a lot about what Q is, even though we don't have a copy of it. We assume it existed. And we assume it existed in written form. And I'll show you why. One particular reason is that there's a non-canonical, a non-biblical gospel called Thomas that apparently is using this source also. So we have good reasons to believe that this really did exist in a written form in the ancient world.
Indication when Thomas was written?
Thomas is also written in the 1st century, but very, very late. We think maybe around 100, maybe 95. It's a late gospel. It's a Gnostic gospel, but it is the only Gnostic gospel we have that actually dates back barely into the 1st century. But we believe that it does utilize some of the Q source. And we're going to talk more about Q in a moment. Likewise, Luke had a source or sources unique to Luke's gospel. You can imagine what we call that, right? That's the L source. Not surprisingly, the source is called L. Okay, just not imaginative at all. So, okay. Scholars can be in the unimaginative lot sometimes. They really can when they name stuff. All right. Now, what we're going to call the arguments for the Markan priority. Here's the basic question at hand. If one of the ways we're going to solve the synoptic problem, you have to ask yourself, which of the three synoptics, Matthew, Mark, or Luke, is the source for the others? Okay, that seems like a fair question. If there's a sense of interconnectedness, which one is it? Well, we're going to show you why we believe Mark is, we call it Markan priority. Why we believe Mark was the first one written. And once you see this, it seems pretty hard to deny it. Once you start looking at the literary evidence. I'm going to walk you through it, and I'm curious to see what you think. We're going to show you the work that the scholars have done to arrive at this. Okay. The presumption behind the four-source hypothesis is that the theory that Matthew and Luke used both used Mark as a source. That in order for this four-source hypothesis to work, Mark has to have priority. Mark has to come first. That's what's behind it. That's the assumption. Okay. Markan priority, the view that Mark was the first of the Synoptic Gospels to be written and was one of the sources used by both Matthew and Luke. That's an assumption. Now let's show you the arguments for, the hypothesis is Mark was written first. To become a theory, we have to have evidence for it. Now I'm going to show you the evidence. Okay. 3 arguments have proved widely convincing for establishing Mark's priority to Matthew and Luke. Let me also state, by the way, though this is a kind of literary science, it's like a social science, we're dealing with probability here. In science, you have experimentation in order to test your hypotheses to see whether or not they actually can become theories. We do similar things in this, but remember, this is all based on probability, not on pure deduction. It's inductive logic, okay? Because there's no way, we have to admit, and scholars will admit, this is not as foolproof as a logical equation or a mathematical equation. 2 plus 2 is going to equal 4, and we can prove that mathematically. We can't prove, beyond a shadow of a doubt, Markan priority, but the evidence is pretty convincing. Okay. All right. I said there were 3 basic arguments. Let's start with the first one. Patterns of agreement. Okay. We're going to line up our 3 Gospels here. If we make a detailed comparison of word-for-word agreements among the Synoptic Gospels, an interesting pattern emerges. Okay. Sometimes all 3 Gospels tell a story in precisely the same way. Okay? And so, basically I use my little green borders to show, okay, a story is being told by all 3 Gospels exactly the same way. Word for word the same. Okay? That happens among some of the stories in the Gospels, of the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Okay? This would happen whenever 2 of the authors borrowed their account from the earliest one, and neither of them changed it. Right? Okay. No matter who's first, if one of them is first, the other 2 are borrowing from it, and they just make no changes when they borrow the story. Okay? That's when you're going to get this pattern. Okay? All right. Sometimes all 3 Gospels differ. In this kind of situation right here, where they're just telling different stories. Now, believe it or not, you can see that happening in the resurrection accounts. Yes, they all tell the story of Jesus being raised, but all 3 of them tell the story differently. It's not the same women who go to the tomb. It's not the same number of women who go to the tomb. It's not the same number of angels who are in the tomb. It's not the same location of the angels in or around the tomb. All 3 Gospels differ in that. Okay? I'm not going to, I can't explain why. I can just tell you that they are different. And I'm not making this up. You can look for yourself just to see. Okay. This would happen whenever two authors who borrowed the story each changed it in different ways. Okay. No matter who had the story first, it's possible that the other two borrowed the story, but both of them independently made changes. Make sense? That's when you'd get a pattern like this. Okay. Everyone, this makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Finally, there are sometimes two of the three Gospels are exactly alike, but the third differs. All right. Now, this is what helps us to determine Markan priority. Because this would occur when both of the latter authors borrowed the story, but only one of them changed it. In this case, one of the redactors would agree with the wording of his source, and the other would not. Make sense? Okay. Now, this is where...
Is there any indication that the authors of Matthew and Luke were able to collaborate?
At the moment, we don't think so, and I'll show you why. And it comes down to the Q source, believe it or not. Tell you what, I'll as I go through, if I don't make more sense to answer that question, that's a good question. I mean, that is a fair question, because that's exactly what one of the possible patterns could be. If we're honest with ourselves, you might say, for example, maybe Mark wrote first, that Matthew borrowed from Mark, and then Luke borrowed from Matthew, and had that kind of connection.
So as a follow-on question, it seems to me that I recall a couple weeks ago you mentioned that the author of Luke was likely an educated person.
Oh, most certainly. You can tell from his Greek, yeah.
So do you feel that the difference in education levels may account for some of the disparities in a way that...
Oh, definitely. Yeah, you're exactly right. Yeah, in fact, it can account for it simply because Luke is the one who's, as you're going to see as we go through this, Luke is the one who's going to make more changes, assuming that Mark is the source, and we're going to, again, show you. Assuming that Mark is the source, Luke makes radical changes to Mark, and really needs to. Not only is Luke a well-polished Greek speaker and writer, Mark is the exact opposite. His Greek is atrocious. In fact, some of his Greek invites change, if that makes sense. So, but let's see if I can answer that a bit further as we go along, okay? But it's because of this pattern that this is what helps us to determine Markan priority in this pattern of agreement. Patterns of agreement. Let me show you why. In this third situation, sometimes Matthew and Mark share the wording of the story when Luke differs. That's what you see in this pattern right here. Okay. Sometimes Mark and Luke share the same wording when Matthew differs, and that's what you see in this pattern. Okay. Now, but it is very rare to find Matthew and Luke sharing the wording of a story also found in Mark when Mark differs. That almost never happens. All right. Why would this be? Well, the only answer to that is, if Matthew were the source for Mark and Luke, we would not get this pattern of agreement that I just showed you. Okay. Likewise, if Luke were the source for Matthew and Mark, we would not get this pattern of agreement. The reason then that Matthew and Luke rarely agree against Mark is that Mark is the source for Matthew and Luke. It just the patterns. It's not proof, but the patterns in this argument strongly suggest Markan priority. Now, if this argument alone was all we were using, that you might say, well, okay, yeah, that sounds good, but it's not it's not convincing yet. I'm going to show you two more arguments that lead to Markan priority. Okay, this one is called the sequence of narrative. Okay, now watch this. One of the most striking aspects of the synoptic problem is that even though Matthew and Luke do not often agree together against Mark in the wording of the stories, which all three share, they do extensively agree in the wording of passages which are not found in Mark. All right, so what we're acknowledging is that there, and I'm using these little color bars to indicate individual stories that happen to appear not in Mark, but they do appear in Matthew and Luke. Okay, now what that's going to tell you is they are somehow or other Matthew and Luke do have some material that you don't find in Mark. Where are they getting that if Mark is first? Okay, that's a fair question. By the way, to jump ahead, we believe that's the Q source, but I'll explain that later. Okay, now.
I'm sorry, Chris, I got another question.
Sure, no problem.
So from a geography perspective, what kind of area are we talking about that the three authors would have been contained?
Good question. I will tell you. I can't remember whether we're going to bring that up in a future lesson, but since you asked, we know that Mark is not written in Palestine, because you can tell from the way he writes that he's writing to a Gentile audience wherever he is, because he's always explaining Jewish terms. I mean, for example, if he says Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, he has to explain that. But to a Jewish audience, if you were writing to Jewish Christians, he wouldn't need to. Or when Jesus raises the little girl, Talitha kum, he says, and then it means little girl, get up. He doesn't have to explain that, which he does. It's almost like a parenthetical statement. Mark puts that in there. Or he'll say such things as, it was the time of the Passover, the festival of the Jews. He doesn't need to say that if he's writing to a Jewish Christian audience. So we know he's writing to a Gentile audience, simply because he takes the time to explain to his audience terms they would not be familiar with. All right, so we know he's not writing in Palestine. There are some internal evidence that suggests he might be writing in Rome, but we can't. That's just bare speculation from one little piece of information in the gospel. That's not enough for us to say definitively. But there are some scholars who think he's writing in Rome. We just don't know. But it's not Palestine. He is not in Palestine. We're certain of it. Matthew is writing near Palestine. His gospel. All the major sources of Matthew come out of Antioch, so we believe that the gospel was written in or near Antioch. Luke's gospel, we don't even have a clue, other than the fact we know it's not written in Palestine because he knows nothing about Palestinian geography. And how do we know that? The way he narrates in the sequence the stories of Jesus. He's got Jesus starting in chapter 9 in Luke's Gospel on the road to Jerusalem. From chapter 9 all the way to chapter 20 or 19, Jesus is on the road to Jerusalem. Now, if he's on the road to Jerusalem, it's rather interesting in those chapters on the road to Jerusalem. He's got Jesus here and here and here, and then suddenly he's got him back up here in places that just make no sense if you're looking at the way if you're following the narrative. So basically, Luke knows these stories happened. He doesn't know when or where they happened. as he's stringing this, all the gospel writers, we believe, are basically taking individual stories of Jesus like little pearls and stringing them on a necklace, sort of like a Pandora bracelet. You know, you're putting on your little baubles, and you put them on in the order you want. And that's what we think is happening with all the gospel writers. That they know stories about Jesus, but remember, they're writing several decades later, so they're just stringing the stories together the way they think they want to narrate the story. Does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah. So they know stories about Jesus. They don't necessarily know the order in which those stories happened.
The reason why I ask is that I'm trying to figure out whether or not Q would have been first-hand accounts, and it's sounding like that would have been the case.
We can't rule that out. That's a possibility. It would be very much helpful if we could find a copy of Q. I harbor hopes someday that somewhere there's some cavern or some clay jar somewhere that's holding a copy of Q. I will tell you, quite frankly, I'm convinced that it did exist. I really believe that document did exist. So I do hope we find it.
Well, is the fact that they all copied from Mark the reason why we don't see anything that goes back before Jesus' ministry? You know, we don't ever get a glimpse of his young adulthood or him in his 20s. We only get that little 3-year block of.
Yeah, there's. It's interesting you mentioned that. There are actually some non-canonical gospels that do some infancy narratives of Jesus that are fascinating to read, and they're sometimes scary. The infancy gospel of Thomas is an interesting read. Jesus is. I mean, that gospel basically portrays Jesus as a little Dennis the Menace, like what would happen if God were Dennis the Menace, and it's just a. Strange accounts, but I mean interesting, but strange.
But they still don't seem to go any farther than any farther forward than his childhood, and they don't go into that big gap that we just don't know what was going on.
Believe it or not, the question you're asking, and when you apply that to the Gospels that we do have in our New Testament, it really does say something about what the authors intended. Mark. We're just assuming that people had all sorts of stories about Jesus in circulation. Why Mark chooses to start his gospel at the baptism tells us something that he doesn't consider Jesus, his early life, as being significant. If he did, he would have very likely have included it. Notice that basically, with some rare exceptions, Matthew and Luke will take us back to the birth of Jesus, even though they're telling us different stories about the birth of Jesus. But as soon as they tell those stories to make their point, suddenly they're at the baptism as well. So what that tells you is that the early life of Jesus, for the gospel writers, is technically insignificant to them for the story they're trying to tell. If Matthew and Luke are telling us about the birth of Jesus, it's because they think that his birth is foreshadowing what's going to happen the rest of his life, and that's the only reason Matthew and Luke tell us the birth stories. The fact that they don't tell us, Luke does tell us something about Jesus at 12, but that's also just an incidental story. They don't tell us anything about his adolescence. They don't tell us anything about his young adulthood, how he became a carpenter, things like that. They just don't consider that pertinent to telling the story, and that in itself is significant. Now here, Matthew and Luke often present the stories of their Gospels in the same sequence, stories which are shaped with Mark and in the same sequence as Mark. So what you're seeing is here, note, when you have this situation of stories that all three share, even if their wording is different, if they have the same stories, note, all of those stories are in the same sequence. They happen in the same order. Okay? That's interesting. It means two of them are using one as the scaffolding or the framework for telling the story. Okay? Now, there are differences. Watch this. The other passages, the ones I just showed you that we have it only in Mark and in Luke, those are not in the same order. Now, look at what we're saying. The stories that all three share are in the same order. The stories that Matthew and Luke share without Mark, they are not. Isn't that interesting?
So they couldn't be copying from each other.
That's it. That's it. You got it. Matthew and Luke cannot be copying from each other. Otherwise, why would they take these stories and put them in different orders?
Why couldn't you use different sources?
What they have is one source that they are the Q source that they are picking information from and dropping it in different locations within the framework that they're getting from Mark. Does that make sense? Why would this be? This is what happens. The best explanation is that Matthew and Luke each use Mark as one of their sources, following Mark's sequence, as you see here, and also had a different source, Q, which they plucked into the narrative sequence of Mark at respectively different places. In effect, they're just dropping them into the stories in different places. What they've done is they've basically taken Mark's gospel in his sequence, but they also have Q, and then but they're dropping Q in different places because it meets their needs to have it where they put it. I know that sounds weird, but again, this is more evidence of Markan priority. Okay, because everything that the three share follow the same sequence, except where Luke and Matthew have material in common, but are in different sequences. Interesting, isn't it? Okay. Thus, the sequence of the narrative implies a Markan priority. Okay. Now, that's the second piece of evidence. Third piece of evidence, the characteristics of the changes. Okay. This is one of my favorites right here. That again emphasizes the Markan priority. One final argument for Markan priority is that the kinds of differences in wordings which one finds among the three Gospels implies that Matthew and Luke used Mark as a source. Sometimes Mark used awkward grammar, strange wording, and incorrect citations. I'm not trying to be offensive or insulting to Mark, but his grammar is horrible. I'm sorry, it is. His Greek is just not great. And, by the way, he does cite the Old Testament sometimes incorrectly. I'm not trying to pick on him, but it's a fact. He knows the stories that are in the Old Testament. He just doesn't have a copy of the Old Testament in front of him. But that makes sense because you'd have to be rich to own a copy of the Old Testament. Okay, you would know the stories growing up, hearing them, but having the copies in front of you makes it difficult to go back and check your references. We know Mark made some simple mistakes. All right, he doesn't intend to. They're honest mistakes, but he makes some citation mistakes. Okay, and I'm going to show you one. Okay. And by the way, I'm not making it up. You can look it up for yourself if you think I'm making this up. Okay. In many instances, however, these problems are not found in Matthew and Luke's narrative of the same stories. Why? Because Matthew and Luke know Mark got it wrong and they correct it. Okay? All right. Let us consider the following example. When introducing the ministry of John the Baptizer, John the Baptist, all three Gospels cite the prophet Isaiah in the Jewish Scriptures. Okay? Let's start with Mark. All right? Mark attributes this citation to the book of Isaiah, but in fact, Matthew has conflated two passages, one from Malachi and one from Isaiah. Okay, as it is, this is straight from Mark's Gospel. As it is written in the prophet Isaiah, "See, I am sending my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way. The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight." It's only this part that is Isaiah. This part is Malachi, but Mark only attributes it to Isaiah. Okay, Mark got it wrong. Well, he got it half right. Half right and half wrong. Make sense? Okay. Matthew knows he's got it wrong. Luke knows he's got it wrong. Okay. Let me show you what they do with it. All right. Matthew also attributes the citation to Isaiah, but Matthew does not include the passage from Malachi. He fixes Mark's mistake by taking out Malachi. This is the one whom the prophet Isaiah spoke when he said, "The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight." So basically he's just taken this whole passage out that is Malachi. He says, all right, this guy Mark just made a mistake. We just won't even use we'll just quote Isaiah and just take the Malachi passage out. That appears in Matthew's Gospel. Matthew fixed Mark in the way he tells the story. Make sense? Now look what Luke does. Okay. Likewise, Luke attributes his citation to the book of Isaiah without including the passage of Malachi. Indeed, Luke includes even more of Isaiah in his passage. He extends it even further than Mark does. Prepare the way to make his path straight. The rough ways will be made smooth, and all flesh shall see the salvation of God. It's Isaiah. It's even more of Isaiah than Mark. Now, why is this significant? Why does this show Mark in priority? Let me show you. This difference implies that Mark was the earliest of the three to be written. It would be difficult to understand why Mark would introduce incorrect citations in a passage which posed no problems. If Mark is borrowing from Matthew as his priority, or if he's borrowing from Luke as his priority, why would he intentionally change it? Why would he intentionally make it wrong? No, it makes more sense to say that Matthew and Luke correct Mark's mistake. That is a simpler explanation. Okay. Again, this is not foolproof, but it makes sense. Okay. Mark's gospel, from all three, when you take all three of these arguments together, all of them pretty much agree. Mark is very likely the first gospel. Okay. Make sense? Okay. Okay. It is easier, however, to see why Matthew and Luke might have wanted to eliminate such problems. They just want to fix the problems. And by the way, they also clean up Mark's grammar often, which is another indication that Mark comes first. Because why, if Mark is copying from Matthew and Luke, why would he intentionally take a grammatically correct sentence and then put in a wrong verb tense? Why do that? There's no reason to do it. So it's more likely that Matthew and Luke are correcting Mark. Okay. Okay. Now, basically, that's the synoptic problem. Now, I'm just offering that out there. You can see this is the work scholars have done. I think it's very good work. It really does. It's highly suggestive. That pretty convincing to me that Mark was first. I mean, I'm convinced by it, but again, I'll admit it's not 100% foolproof. I admit that, but this is pretty good evidence. Q. Now let's talk about the Q source. All right. Once Mark is established as the priority, prior to Matthew and Luke, the Q hypothesis naturally implies itself from what we were already talking about with comparisons earlier. Matthew and Luke both have passages not found in Mark, and these passages sometimes agree word for word. Okay. From whence do these other passages come? It is unlikely that one of the authors used Mark. This is what we were talking about earlier. It's unlikely that one of the authors used Mark, added several passages of his own, and then this account then served as the source for the other. That is highly unlikely. Let me show you why. It goes back to that sequence argument. Okay. If this were the case, this example that I just showed you, we would not be able to explain the phenomenon noted earlier that these passages found in Mark and Luke, but in Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark, are almost always inserted in these other authors in different sequences from Mark. Why would they, if they're following the sequence down the line, why then would Luke suddenly change the sequence of those stories that are unique to Matthew and Luke? That's highly unlikely that he just happened to stumble upon those elements that are in Matthew but not in Mark, and then changed only those elements in the sequence. Make sense? No, we have to believe that Matthew and Luke are borrowing from Mark, and they're doing so independently. They are unaware of each other. Or if they do know about each other, they are not talking to each other about the writing of their Gospels. Okay. Why would an author follow the sequence in one of his sources except for the materials which are not found in the other one? Okay. It is more likely that these passages are drawn from another source which no longer exists, the source which scholars designate as Q. Most scholars believe that Q must have been a written document, otherwise it would be difficult to explain such long verbatim agreements between Matthew and Luke. How can they write the same thing in the same Greek, word for word, in the order if it weren't a written source? Okay. I want to back up on that just a moment. Another thing that also contributes to the existence of the Q source is that the material in Q that we find in Matthew and in Luke, but not in Mark, all have something in common. They are all sayings of Jesus. They're not narratives. They are sayings. So, in effect, Q is a collection of Jesus' sayings. And that's why the stories don't appear in the same sequence as they do when we look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Because what's happening is the Q source is a collection of Jesus' sayings without any narrative explaining the context in which Jesus said that. All they have are Jesus' sayings in the Q source. And so what's happening is Matthew and Luke are following Mark's sequence, but they also have Q, a collection of Jesus' sayings, and they think, this looks like a good place where Jesus would have said that. And they put it in there. But they're both working independently, so they are putting them in different places where they think Jesus would have said it.
What is the gospel that didn't make it into the Bible that you said had the sayings of Jesus?
The Gospel of Thomas. And
Okay, now that's not the same as the scripture.
No, it's not, because the Gospel of Thomas is. There are a lot of sayings that it's very mixed when we start talking about the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas contains a lot of sayings of Jesus that you've read in the Gospels. It contains a lot of things that sound similar to what Jesus says, but not quite. And there are some things that are the exact opposite of what Jesus has said, and some things we've never heard of. It's just an interesting mishmash of sayings of Jesus in Thomas's Gospel. Really, really weird stuff in some cases. I can't remember if I told you, number 114 in the Gospel of Thomas is one where Mary Magdalene is following the disciples after Jesus is raised from the dead, and the disciples are all upset that this woman is following them. Okay, and Jesus says, "Don't worry about Mary following us. I will turn her into a man, and then she will be subject to salvation." Hardly anything that advances women's liberation. But just weird stuff. But it's Gnostic because that was also, we know that was a belief of the Gnostics, that women were not subject to salvation. Only men were in the Gnostic tradition. So we're pretty convinced that Thomas was a Gnostic gospel for that very reason. So anyway, Q is a collection of Jesus' sayings. That's the one thing it has in common. Okay. That also lends credulity to the fact that has got to be a source that both Matthew and Luke have. Okay. Let me. I've still got a few more minutes. I think I can get this finished. Okay. So we can get ourselves set for. We've got to take a 2 weeks break. When I come back from vacation, we'll jump into Matthew. I'm so sorry because I'm excited. I'd like to get into it. Okay. So. All right, the M and the L sources. Little is known about these sources designated M and L. Okay, because these are sources which provide material found either in Matthew or in Luke alone, there is nothing to compare them to in order for us to decide their basic character. We don't know anything about this source material. We just make up this hypothetical source, M or L, and I admit it's a made-up source. We don't. We assume that it existed in some form, because we are assuming that that Matthew and Luke aren't just making stuff up willy-nilly. We assume that they have source material. Okay. Now, this does beg the question, what is the source material? We do not know, for example, whether M or L is only one source or a group of sources. We do not know. We don't know if Matthew is using a whole bunch of independent sources that we're just lumping together as M, and the same with Luke. Likewise, we don't know whether M or L are written or oral sources. We do not know. Maybe Matthew knows stories about Jesus, and we're just calling it M. It may not be a written source. It just may be oral tradition that Matthew's aware of. And the same with Luke. We have no idea. We just don't know.
We also don't know for sure that these are all written by one person, do we?
What, the source materials or the Gospels?
The Gospels.
We're pretty certain that... We know that, of course, with the exception of some scribal insertions, that Matthew and Mark and Luke, the Synoptic Gospels, are probably the work primarily of one person. Simply by style and orthography, we can pretty much tell that they are. John's Gospel is completely different on that front. We do believe that we can see what we call literary scenes in John. We believe that John is the work of a community because it switches back and forth sometimes in the narrative. Sometimes it says, we have written this down so that you might believe. Who's we? We believe that we do believe that there's a good likelihood that John, the beloved disciple, could have been the original source for a rough draft of the gospel that became John. We believe that John's community took that material and over decades built upon it to give us the stories that we now know as John's Gospel. But we do believe that John's Gospel is the work of a number of hands that were edited together. Brilliantly done in an editing, because in my opinion, Luke's Gospel is one of the most brilliant John's Gospel is one of the most brilliant pieces of literary work when you look at what he's doing. It's the Greek is simple, but the theological ideas expressed in John are complex and well written. It is written like a work of art. John's Gospel utilizes irony all throughout the Gospel, intentional double meanings all throughout the pages of that Gospel, and it's done intentionally to confuse the characters in the story in almost every chapter, so that the reader has a God's eye view and understands what's going on, but the characters in the story don't. That's just an interesting literary tool that John uses. It's brilliant work, it's just one of my favorite Gospels. We'll have a chance to take a look at that when we get to it. What's clear is that these stories came from somewhere, since it appears unlikely that the Gospel authors simply made them up. Methodological significance of the four-source hypothesis. Why is it important for us to know this? The four-source hypothesis allows us to apply redaction analysis as a tool for studying the Gospels. Once you know that that Mark is source material for Matthew and Luke, now we have a new literary tool for studying them. Okay, and that is it's a standard tool that people use in literary analysis called redaction analysis. If you have the source that your writer uses, you can go to the source and see what the source material that the writer is pulling from, and you look at the editorial changes that the author makes, and that tells you something about his audience and about the author. Why make those changes? Why not just copy the original source word for word? Sometimes he does, but where he makes changes, that tells you something about his theology. And that's called, as I say, redaction analysis. I'm getting ahead of myself. If we have the author's source, we can determine how he changed it. If Matthew, for example, altered the story he found in Mark, we can surmise that his changes tell us something about his own theology, and it does. The beauty of this, the beauty of any kind of literary analysis, when you take a look at, when you start applying them to the books of the Bible, is that you really begin to see exactly what the theological nuances are of that particular writer. What is that author telling us? And that gets sort of confusing, because when people read the New Testament, they often conflate the stories of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. If you can isolate them and just look at what Mark is saying, what Matthew is saying independently, and what Luke is saying independently, you begin to see that each one has his own particular theological bent. And that is enriching, because that gives you so much more of a view of how Matthew, Mark, and Luke understood God and how they understood the person of Jesus Christ. There's this, I can't remember whether it's Buddhist or Hindu, but there's this wonderful ancient parable in those religions that tell of 4 blind men or 5 blind men standing around an elephant. You may have heard the story before.
That was Hindu, I believe.
It may be Hindu, but note that they all think that they're describing the same elephant, but they each describe it as something different. Like they think it's a rope from the tail, or a tree trunk from the legs, things like that. They're all describing the same elephant. And in effect, what we're doing is taking a look at how Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as when we get to him, how all 4 of them are looking at the same Jesus and have a different image of that Jesus. And that's very enriching. Because what we saw, for example, in our study of Mark earlier, he sees Mark as the suffering servant of God. Okay. Now, Matthew and Luke are not going to deny Jesus' suffering servanthood, but they have another agenda about who this Jesus is, and you're going to see that. Matthew has his own take on it. He's going to focus on Jesus as a kind of second Moses, whereas Luke is going to focus on Jesus as Savior. In fact, the word Savior, this may surprise you, I challenge you, look it up. In the 4 Gospels, Luke is the only one to use the term Savior. That is what I find interesting. We Christians talk about Jesus Christ as our Savior, and He is, but it's only Luke's Gospel that actually calls Him that. Matthew never does, nor does Mark. That is just an interesting, and you wouldn't notice that if you didn't do this kind of literary analysis. Does that make sense? It's so fascinating. We get a much richer view of Jesus by looking at what each author is telling us. In the next section, we will apply redaction analysis to our study of Matthew's Gospel. So we're going to use that tool. We're going to throw ourselves into Matthew's Gospel next time. That's why the synoptic problem and this literary hypothesis is important. It gives us new tools for studying the Gospels. Does that make some sense?